3 years ago, almost to the day, I gave a homily on the subject, the discipline of joy. And it was the story, really, of how personal tragedy, the loss of my son, taught me to live joyfully. But I admitted at the time I still couldn't reconcile personal joy with the suffering of other people. That's the big one. And since then, the world apparently has got a lot worse. We've had the whole Ukraine war happen since, the disaster in the Middle East, the climate crisis is getting worse, and there's a terrifying rise of the right wing, the extreme right, across the world. So for we Unitarians, who have a very clear moral compass, very progressive ideas, and we believe in the equal worth and dignity of every human being, in justice, equity, compassion in human relations, and the free and responsible search for truth and meaning, and of course respect for the interconnected web of life and all that, it seems everything we believe in is under threat. We can even worry about whether it's morally justifiable to be joyful in the face of other people's misery on that scale. Well, this I'm very clear about. I get preachy. I think we must be joyful. We really must be at least cheerful in the face of what's going on. It's an act of defiance. So I urge you now, Michael mentioned it earlier, we really need to stand up and make the most of this world. So how do we live cheerfully? And you will notice that I have been using the word cheerful in this title rather than joyful. That's mainly because joy, I think, has been a bit devalued, the word, overused. But I use the terms interchangeably, really. I would say a good start for living joyfully are the 8 pillars of joy, as defined by the Dalai Lama and Desmond Tutu. And these are perspective, humility, humor, acceptance, gratitude, forgiveness, compassion, and generosity. And of these, I think the last 4 are self-explanatory. The first 4 maybe need some unpicking. Acceptance. Yes, terrible things are happening right now, and most of them we are completely powerless to do anything about. That's humility, actually. It doesn't reduce the moral imperative to act where we can, but we have to accept where we really can't. And humor comes into that too. We should never take ourselves too seriously. It's not all up to us. But I think the key is perspective. The news, whatever our source, is very selective, not very accurate. We hear a lot about war, but actually most human suffering goes unreported. It's poverty, exploitation, domestic violence, disease, bereavement. It was ever thus. But it's also true that almost none of the good and hopeful stuff makes it to the news either. And cooperation, kindness, resilience, and fun actually keep communities functioning. They don't make the news, and social progress takes place incrementally, not dramatically. So that doesn't make the news either. It's only noticeable in retrospect. And a useful exercise is to look back at the bad old days, and then you realize we've come a long way. We only ever see a snapshot in time, and global events always have unexpected consequences. For instance, the COVID pandemic, which literally isolated us, had almost the opposite effect. We can now attend events around the world. We have Linda regularly joining us from Prince Edward Island. I run my disco and I have people dropping in from around the world. I run a Zoom disco every week. So I can say with confidence that 2025 will be very complicated and full of surprises. Being able to change your perspective is crucial at a personal level as well. It's something I do as a hypnotherapist, and I'm going to invite you to do a little exercise right now. It's very easy. You can do it anywhere, anytime. I'd like you, please, to notice what you've been thinking, feeling, and doing the last few moments. And now I'd like you to say to yourself, stop. Take a deep breath, and on the slow out breath, straighten your spine, drop your shoulders, relax your face, especially your jaw, and bring your attention into something in your immediate sensations. For instance, how are the soles of your feet feeling right now? Keep up the slow out breaths and keep saying stop. What this exercise shows you is that your thoughts, feelings, and actions are just your experience and not who you are. They're like the waves on the surface of the sea, and you are the sea, not the waves. It's a very useful little exercise. As I say, you can do it anywhere, anyhow, and it's a way of interrupting habitual thoughts and moods. If you find yourself, despairing about the world, interrupt those habits of thought using this little exercise, and then switch your attention to something else, something more useful, something that cheers you up. For me, it's usually dancing, but sometimes it's Sudoku. Another important aspect of perspective is useful beliefs. Now, here are my useful beliefs. I choose them for usefulness, but they're not completely arbitrary. There is supporting evidence for these, and although they won't be the truth, of course, I think they're a better model than the conventional paradigm. The conventional paradigm being everything is reducible to matter, consciousness is just a byproduct of brain. Useful belief number 1. These are mine. You can choose your own. Reality is vastly much greater than we're aware of, and the human person is much greater than our current lives. We are not extinguished by physical death. This life is just one aspect of a greater whole. So none of those suffering and dying in wars the world over are actually lost. And there just might be meaning and purpose in it all. Useful belief number 2, everything and everybody is connected. As the yogi Ramana Maharshi put it when asked, how should we treat others? He said, there are no others. Useful belief number 3 is the theory of morphic resonance, which is an explanation for how habits form throughout nature. And this theory has very wide application. It's been developed in detail by Rupert Sheldrake and tested empirically, and it deserves a whole homily. But I'll try to summarize it. When any natural system adopts a new behavior, that behavior creates a field, like an echo, which influences similar systems to behave in a similar way. With each repetition, the field becomes stronger and the behavior more likely until it can become universal. And this means that much of what we assume is immutable human nature is in fact habit. For instance, most of the human societies that we know about, certainly since the Ice Age, seem to have been governed by a tiny ruling elite of wealthy men who hold all the political and religious power. And as my friend, the late historian Charlotte Waterlow observed, and I have often repeated, the vast majority of the people who have ever lived have been told what to do by the lords and what to think by the priests. All innovation, all progress starts with thought. And at some stage, somebody must have had the idea that things could be different. And that created a little field which made the idea easier for others to think until it resulted in major changes. And we've now seen many experiments in representative government, and they're certainly all flawed, but some remarkable progress has taken place. And for instance, our last provincial election, just a few months ago, British Columbia elected a legislature that is 52% female. And that fact went almost unremarked because women in politics are no longer a big deal. It's become habit. However, the old morphic fields don't go away, and clearly the idea of the strong male leader with absolute power, who is above the law, still has appeal. If there's anything in the theory, then the more we think progressive ideas, the easier it is for others to think them too. Now, I'm a great believer in the power of thought and imagination because, of course, as a hypnotherapist, it's the only tools I use, that and my voice. And I know how powerful it can be. So here's a little exercise I do each day. I think, for me, it's a form of prayer, but you can easily do this just as an act of imagination. You know, what if, just suppose. So I think, what if our leaders took for granted that their ultimate goal is for all people and all species to have the basic means with which to flourish on this planet? What if they recognize that it's enlightened self-interest to ensure that your traditional enemies have their needs met? Because actually, security lies in not being hated. And what if all our religious leaders recognized that if they claim to stand for peace and justice, they must inevitably make three concessions? They must admit fallibility, they must condemn collective punishment, and they must assert the equal worth of women and men and all humanity. It doesn't sound like much, imagining a better world, but it's better than despair, and at least it's better for me. But of course, at a local level, we can both imagine and act. And Victoria is full of community gardens, free little libraries, history projects, art projects, rewilding projects. I mean, all of these started with somebody's imagination, enthusiasm, and then it came into reality. Absolutely everything starts with an idea in the human-made world. So, imagining ahead, I'd like to be a social influencer, a social media influencer. I don't know what it is really, but I do know that the influence of social media on young people has caused an epidemic of depression and anxiety. And I want to cause an epidemic, a habit of cheerfulness. I want that cheerfulness and positivity just to become ingrained, to become habit. And you need to start with young people. I don't know how to do this, but that's my aim. And a lovely thing about feature of good cheer is that the more you give it away, the more you have yourself. And we who have the privilege of choice in our lives can do these things. We can do what we love and what we're good at. And I'll end with a quote from the 20th century African-American philosopher Howard Thurman. Don't ask what the world needs. Ask what makes you come alive and go do it. Because the world needs more people who've come alive.